After 120 years, a sunken ship is raised from the ocean floor, one that everyone believed was a victim of a storm. But what they found inside shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The ship had lived most of its existence as a footnote. For more than a century, it had existed only in fragmented records, half-legible insurance documents, and the occasional speculative article written by historians who never quite agreed on what had truly happened. Officially, it was a passenger vessel launched at the beginning of the 20th century, built to carry emigrants and cargo across the Atlantic at a time when steel hulls were still symbols of progress and confidence. Its loss was recorded as tragic but unremarkable. A storm, a navigational error, excessive load, and a sea that showed no mercy. Hundreds of names were marked as lost, compensation was paid, and within a few years the world moved on. That official version had endured because it was convenient. The coordinates of the wreck were imprecise, the testimonies contradictory, and the era itself forgiving toward maritime disasters. Ships vanished often enough in those years that one more did not disturb the broader narrative of progress. For decades, the vessel lay untouched on the seabed, its steel slowly surrendering to salt and pressure, its secret sealed by darkness and depth. Even among salvage specialists, it was not considered particularly promising. No famous passengers, no celebrated artwork, no legendary treasure associated with its name. Just another wreck. What changed was not history, but opportunity. Advances in lifting technology, combined with a rare alignment of funding and political clearance, made the project suddenly viable. A consortium formed under the banner of historical preservation, publicly emphasizing scientific research and cultural recovery. Privately, there were other motivations. Exclusive rights to any artifacts, media access, and the prestige of accomplishing a technically complex lift all played their part. The operation was framed as careful, respectful, and methodical. No one involved expected a scandal. At most, they anticipated debates about ownership and museum placement. Michael Coleman joined the expedition without any sense that it would define his career. He was hired because he was reliable, precise, and unromantic about wrecks. His work history was filled with collapsed rigs, sunken ferries, and industrial accidents where mistakes had been paid for with lives. He did not chase legends. He trusted corrosion patterns, pressure damage, and the quiet language of metal. As a diver, he believed that the sea rarely lied, even when people did. From the start, he treated the ship as a technical problem. Before the first descent, he spent days reviewing the surviving plans and photographs. They were incomplete, as expected, but sufficient to establish a baseline. According to the documents, the hull should have shown catastrophic breach damage consistent with storm-driven stress. There should have been signs of violent flooding, tearing along stress points, and chaotic deformation, where waves and internal pressure had done their work. These expectations were ingrained in every salvage diver who had ever approached a wreck lost to weather. The first descent challenged those assumptions almost immediately. Visibility was limited but workable, and the outline of the hull emerged slowly from the gloom. The ship lay at rest, angled but not twisted, its profile oddly composed. As Michael circled the structure, he noticed that the damage did not tell a story of panic or randomness. Certain breaches appeared linear, controlled, and strangely deliberate. There were no massive tears where the hull should have failed under stress. Instead, there were openings that looked more like the result of planned intervention than catastrophe. He did not voice these observations immediately. Experience had taught him that first impressions could deceive, especially underwater, where scale and perspective played tricks on the eye. He continued his survey methodically, recording footage and noting details without interpretation. Yet, as he moved along the outer decks, another inconsistency became impossible to ignore. There were no clear signs of a rushed evacuation. Lifeboat mounts were intact, not torn or twisted. Railings bore corrosion, but little evidence of desperate human traffic. It was as if the ship had gone down quietly, without the chaos that usually accompanied such disasters. The position of the wreck deepened his unease. Ships lost in storms often came to rest in contorted attitudes, their final moments reflected in their posture on the seabed. This vessel lay as though it had been guided into place, its weight distributed in a manner that suggested balance rather than collapse. Michael could not yet explain it, but the geometry felt wrong. The technical phase of the operation intensified. Engineers prepared the lifting strategy with painstaking care, aware that a century-old hull could fold under its own mass if stressed incorrectly. Cables were positioned in reinforced zones, and temporary supports were installed to stabilize weak sections. Every decision carried risk. A snapped cable or misjudged lift point could send thousands of tons of steel crashing back into the depths, potentially killing anyone too close. Tension built not from drama, but from the knowledge that failure would be final. During this phase, Michael was authorized for limited internal penetration. The access points were chosen conservatively, using existing breaches to avoid cutting into unstable sections. Inside, the ship revealed an unsettling degree of preservation. Corridors still followed their original lines, and fixtures clung stubbornly to bulkheads. Objects lay where they had fallen, not scattered by violent currents. Plates, signage, fragments of furniture all suggested a vessel that had not been torn apart by panic. It was here that Michael began noticing details that did not belong on a passenger ship. Certain doors were reinforced beyond necessity, fitted with heavier locking mechanisms than the plans indicated. Some partitions seemed newer than the surrounding structure, their metal composition subtly different. These were not the refinements of luxury or safety. They were functional, utilitarian, and out of place. He recorded everything, suppressing speculation. Salvage work demanded discipline, not imagination. Still, as he moved deeper toward the cargo holds, he encountered the anomaly that would anchor itself in his mind. Beneath layers of sediment and corrosion, the structure of the lower hull appeared thicker than expected. Where the plans showed empty volume, there was metal. Not debris, not collapse, but deliberate construction. A secondary layer. Michael paused longer than protocol recommended. He traced the seams with his gloved hand, following the rivet patterns. They were not original. The spacing was different. The technique slightly more modern than the surrounding framework. This was not damage. This was addition. Someone had altered the ship after its launch, and not in a way that served passengers. When he surfaced and reviewed the footage, the implications settled heavily. A double structure inside a ship lost under benign explanations transformed the entire context of the project. Such modifications were expensive, complex, and purposeful. They suggested concealment. Whatever lay behind that metal was not intended to be found. As the day ended and the sea darkened around the operation vessels, Michael found himself unable to shake the sense that the salvage had already crossed a boundary. The project had begun as a technical endeavor governed by physics and engineering. Now it stood on the edge of something else entirely. Not myth or legend, but the uncomfortable territory where history intersected with intent. He reported the structural anomaly in neutral terms, careful not to draw conclusions. The response from management was measured, almost too measured. They acknowledged the finding, suggested further assessment, and emphasized adherence to schedule. Yet, Michael noticed the shift. The wreck was no longer just a wreck. It had become a variable. That night, as the operation lights reflected off the water and the silhouette of the ship loomed beneath the surface, Michael understood that the next descent would not simply reveal more metal. It would begin to expose decisions made long ago by people who had relied on the sea to erase their tracks. The salvage had not yet become a sensation, but it had already ceased to be ordinary. The awareness that something fundamental had been hidden inside the ship did not bring immediate confrontation or drama. It brought procedure. The following morning began with revised safety briefings, additional equipment checks, and a subtle tightening of control over who accessed which sections of the wreck. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, everyone involved understood that the ship was no longer just an object of recovery. It was now a potential source of liability, and possibly of exposure far beyond the scope of a salvage operation. Michael felt the shift before anyone acknowledged it aloud. His role expanded without formal announcement. Questions that once went to engineers or coordinators now reached him first, framed carefully, as if his answers might determine whether the operation moved forward or slowed down. He responded as he always did, sticking to observation and fact, but the weight of his words had changed. What he had seen beneath the hull had altered the hierarchy of certainty. The second descent was planned with greater caution. Additional lighting rigs were mounted, and portable cutting tools were prepared, though their use was restricted. The mandate was clear: observe, document, and avoid irreversible actions unless absolutely necessary. Weather forecasts tightened the schedule, and the sea showed signs of turning, which added pressure to complete internal surveys before conditions worsened. When Michael re-entered the ship, the interior felt different. It was not fear or imagination, but awareness. He was no longer exploring a historical ruin. He was walking through a structure that had been deliberately reshaped. The corridors he had already mapped now appeared less random, their deviations from the original plans forming patterns. Bulkheads that should have aligned symmetrically did not. Stairwells terminated where they should have continued. It was as if the ship had been reorganized around an unseen core. As he moved toward the lower decks, the changes became more pronounced. The passenger areas, though decayed, still bore the marks of their intended function. Decorative elements, numbering systems, and layout logic all spoke of efficiency and volume, not secrecy. Below them, the language of the ship changed. Surfaces were bare, paint stripped or never applied, corners reinforced, and passageways narrowed. These spaces were not designed to be seen, only used. The first reinforced door he encountered was not locked, but it resisted movement far more than a standard internal door should have. Its hinges were heavier, the frame welded into the surrounding structure. When he pushed it open, the sound carried unnaturally, echoing through a space that felt enclosed beyond its dimensions. Inside was a compartment that did not exist on any surviving blueprint. It was small, rectangular, and empty, save for anchor points embedded in the walls and floor. Their purpose was unmistakable, though Michael did not name it yet, even in his own thoughts. He continued, documenting everything with steady precision. Each anomaly was recorded against timestamps and spatial markers. He noted variations in metal thickness, differences in rivet style, and seams that interrupted the original flow of the hull. These were not repairs. Repairs followed damage. These additions followed intent. As he descended further, the double structure revealed itself more clearly. The ship possessed a second internal skin, an added layer that created voids between the original hull and the modified interior. These voids were not uniform. Some were narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Others opened into larger cavities, sealed off with crude but effective welding. Ventilation shafts had been rerouted to accommodate them, disguised among legitimate systems. Michael stopped at one such junction and deployed a fiber optic scope through a narrow seam. The camera feed revealed stacked shapes in the darkness beyond. Rectangular, uniform, arranged deliberately. The edges caught the light briefly before vanishing again into shadow. He did not attempt entry. Even without opening the compartment, the implications were clear. Whatever was inside had been placed there methodically, with time and resources. As he worked, signs of human presence appeared where none should have been. Scuff marks on steel floors, worn not by maintenance traffic but by repeated pacing. Scratches at eye level, uneven and hurried. Remnants of fabric caught in corners, reduced to fibers by time but still identifiable as clothing rather than insulation. These details did not align with cargo handling. They spoke of confinement. In one narrow corridor, he found a series of metal rings embedded along the wall at regular intervals. They were not part of any standard maritime system. Their placement was too deliberate, their wear too specific. The corrosion patterns indicated long-term stress, not decorative attachment. Michael paused longer here, steadying himself against the bulkhead as he recorded them. He understood now that the ship had carried more than goods. It had carried people who were not meant to be accounted for. The deeper he went, the more the atmosphere changed. Sound behaved differently, absorbed rather than reflected. The air felt heavier, though that was likely psychological rather than physical. Yet Michael trusted such sensations. They often accompanied spaces shaped by human suffering, even when all visible traces had eroded away. Pressure from above began to surface through procedural channels. He received instructions to prioritize certain areas and defer others. The language was cautious, framed around efficiency and risk management, but the pattern was unmistakable. The zones of greatest anomaly were the ones leadership preferred to postpone. Michael complied outwardly, but internally he adjusted his path to ensure that nothing significant went undocumented. He encountered the access point to the double floor near the aft cargo hold. It was a hatch disguised beneath layers of sediment and debris, its outline visible only because the surrounding corrosion had behaved differently. The hatch was sealed, its locking mechanism simple but effective. The metal bore signs of manual handling, scratches consistent with repeated opening and closing, not emergency use. This was an operational space, not a forgotten corner. Michael ran his hand along the hatch, tracing the welds. They were rough, functional, and executed without concern for aesthetics. Whoever had done this work had not expected inspection. They had relied on the ocean to finish the job. At this depth, time became a constraint. The dive profile allowed limited exploration before ascent was mandatory. Michael backed away from the hatch, resisting the impulse to force it. Opening it underwater could destabilize the surrounding structure and compromise the integrity of whatever lay beyond. More importantly, it could destroy context. He had learned long ago that evidence mattered more than discovery. When he returned to the surface and reviewed the collected data, the picture sharpened. Engineers confirmed his observations about the second skin. Metallurgical analysis suggested that some of the additions had been made shortly before the ship's final voyage. They were not part of its original construction or early modifications. Someone had altered the vessel with urgency. Discussions among the leadership grew tense. The language shifted from salvage to compliance, from recovery to exposure. Legal advisors became more visible, their presence justified by the growing likelihood that the ship's contents would trigger claims and investigations. The project was still moving forward, but its momentum was no longer purely technical. Michael found himself at the center of an unspoken conflict. He represented the point where observation became interpretation. His documentation carried weight precisely because it was restrained. He did not speculate publicly, but his findings spoke loudly enough on their own. As preparations began for lifting the ship clear of the seabed, Michael understood that the internal survey had reached a threshold. The second skin was no longer a curiosity. It was a boundary. Beyond it lay answers that could not remain confined to steel compartments and archival footnotes. The final moments of the chapter unfolded without ceremony. As the ship was secured for ascent, Michael took one last look at the hatch leading into the hidden lower space. It remained closed, silent, and patient. Whatever it concealed had waited more than a century. It could wait a little longer. But it would not remain hidden once the ship broke the surface. The operation was moving upward now, and with it, the weight of what had been buried inside the hull was beginning to rise toward daylight. The ascent of the ship was not a single moment, but a prolonged ordeal stretched across hours of controlled strain. Steel cables groaned under tension, cranes adjusted their angles by fractions, and the sea itself seemed reluctant to release what it had held for more than a century. When the hull finally breached the surface, it did so without drama, rising slowly, shedding water in heavy sheets that cascaded back into the ocean. There was no triumphant cheer. Only silence, broken by the sound of pumps and the constant hum of machinery. From a distance, the ship looked like a wounded animal dragged from deep water, its rusted body sagging under its own history. Up close, the damage appeared more selective than catastrophic. The structure held together better than expected, confirming the engineer's cautious optimism and reinforcing Michael's growing conviction that the vessel had not met its end through uncontrolled chaos. As the ship was stabilized on floating supports, the atmosphere around the operation changed visibly. Security presence increased. Access points were limited. Cameras appeared where none had been before, justified as documentation tools but positioned as much for oversight as for record-keeping. The project had crossed into a phase where every movement carried implications beyond safety. Michael remained focused on process. His role now extended beyond diving. He participated in controlled internal inspections as water was gradually drained from specific compartments. The goal was preservation, but the unspoken priority was control. What emerged first were expected remnants of cargo and fittings, degraded but unremarkable. These finds satisfied the public narrative for a brief moment, allowing official statements to frame the recovery as a historical success. That illusion ended when the team reached the concealed lower section identified during the dives. The opening of the double floor was approached with caution bordering on ritual. A temporary enclosure was erected, isolating the area from the rest of the deck. Only authorized personnel were allowed inside, and every step was logged. Michael observed the preparations with a growing sense that the ship was no longer merely being salvaged, but examined as a potential crime scene. When the first panel was removed, it revealed not debris, but order. Beneath the outer layer lay a cleanly constructed cavity, its edges sharp where corrosion had been slowed by isolation. Inside were rows of crates, stacked with precision, their arrangement too deliberate to be accidental. The wood was darkened by moisture, but the structure remained intact, reinforced with metal bands that bore markings faint but legible. The first crate was opened under the supervision of multiple observers. The lid came away with resistance, releasing a smell that was not rot but age. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth and fabric, lay metal bars that caught the light even through corrosion. Gold, unmistakable in color and density, heavy in a way that no substitute could mimic. The reaction was immediate but contained. There were no exclamations, no sudden movements. The presence of gold did not inspire excitement so much as calculation. This was not a forgotten hoard or a personal fortune. The markings told a different story. Stamps from multiple financial institutions, dates spanning several years, and serial numbers arranged in systematic sequences. This was not wealth hidden in desperation. It was wealth in transit. As more crates were opened, the scale of the shipment became undeniable. Coins and bars filled the compartment, each unit recorded with a precision that mirrored bank vault procedures. Michael watched as specialists cataloged the finds, their professionalism strained by the implications unfolding before them. This gold matched records of reserves that had vanished during a financial crisis long thought resolved through accounting errors and institutional collapse. Within hours, external experts were summoned. Representatives from financial authorities, historians, and legal observers arrived under conditions of confidentiality that did little to conceal the magnitude of the discovery. Comparisons with archival data confirmed what many suspected, but few dared articulate. The gold corresponded to assets officially declared lost, written off during a period of economic instability that had reshaped entire nations. The ship was no longer just a maritime artifact. It had become evidence. Michael found himself observing not only the gold, but the reactions it provoked. Conversations grew guarded. Phrases like jurisdiction and precedent surfaced repeatedly. Ownership became a contested concept before the last crate was even opened. Banks began asserting historical claims. Governments weighed in cautiously, aware that acknowledgement could reopen unresolved chapters of economic history. Amid this controlled chaos, Michael noticed a parallel effort unfolding quietly. Certain individuals attempted to limit access to the compartment, suggesting that documentation proceed selectively, prioritizing preservation over transparency. There were proposals to remove the gold for safekeeping before full analysis, framed as risk mitigation. Each suggestion, taken alone, sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a pattern. Michael documented everything. He did not argue. He did not accuse. He simply ensured that every movement, every decision, left a trace. He understood that evidence did not vanish only when stolen. It disappeared when context was lost. As the investigation expanded, attention shifted outward. Insurance records were re-examined. Correspondence between shipping companies and financial institutions resurfaced from archives. Patterns emerged that linked the vessel's final voyage to a network of transactions designed to move assets quietly under the guise of routine commerce. The storm that supposedly claimed the ship now appeared less like an act of nature and more like a convenient conclusion. Media interest surged despite attempts to control the narrative. Initial reports focused on the gold, framing it as a dramatic rediscovery. Michael recognized the danger in that framing. Gold captured attention, but it distracted from deeper questions. Why had such wealth been placed aboard a passenger vessel? Who authorized the transport? And why had the ship never reached its destination? Within the operation, divisions sharpened. Some participants viewed the discovery as vindication, a justification for the risk taken. Others saw it as a threat, capable of consuming careers and institutions alike. Meetings grew tense. Decisions were delayed. The project that had once moved with mechanical efficiency now advanced cautiously, burdened by its own significance. Michael's role became increasingly delicate. As the diver who had identified the hidden structure, he was both indispensable and inconvenient. His findings anchored the investigation, but they also prevented simple resolutions. He felt the pressure indirectly, through reassigned tasks and subtle exclusions from certain discussions. Still, his documentation spoke for itself, immune to reinterpretation. The gold had changed everything, but it had not explained everything. As attention fixated on wealth, Michael remained focused on the spaces beyond the crates. Adjacent to the compartment, partially concealed by structural supports, were passages that led deeper into the modified hull. They were narrow, uninvited, and reinforced in ways that suggested containment rather than storage. Late in the day, as light faded and operations slowed, Michael returned to those passages. With authorization secured through persistence rather than invitation, he entered one of the sealed corridors. The air inside was stale, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with oxygen levels. His light revealed surfaces marked by contact, not cargo handling. Scuffs, dents, and abrasions at human height. The traces of movement where movement had not been intended. He stopped before a door that differed from the others. It was reinforced, not to protect what lay inside, but to prevent escape. The handle was worn smooth, the metal around it scarred in a way that spoke of repeated use under stress. Michael did not open it. He did not need to. The presence of the gold had already revealed motive. This door hinted at method. When he stepped back into the open air of the deck, the ship stood transformed in his perception. It was no longer a singular mystery, but a convergence of many. Wealth, secrecy, and now the unmistakable signs of human confinement. The recovery had exposed the first layer of truth, but beneath it lay a story far heavier than gold. As night settled over the operation, floodlights cast long shadows across the rusted hull. Michael watched as guards took positions and crates were sealed under official seals. The ship had survived the ascent intact. Its secrets had not. The fracture had begun, not in steel, but in the story that had held for over 100 years. And Michael knew that the deeper compartments, still unopened, would ensure that the fracture could never be repaired. The discovery of gold should have satisfied the hunger for answers. It provided motive, scale, and a narrative that the public could understand easily. Wealth hidden, transported in secret, lost at sea. It was a story with familiar contours, one that could be contained within legal arguments and financial restitution. Yet, within the hull, beyond the gleam of metal and stamped serial numbers, another story waited, one that could not be framed as profit or loss. The decision to open the reinforced doors adjacent to the gold compartment was delayed under layers of procedure. New teams arrived, bringing with them forensic specialists and representatives of multiple authorities. The ship was now officially treated as a restricted site, governed by protocols more common to crime scenes than salvage yards. Every movement was recorded, every action justified in writing. What had begun as caution now bordered on fear. Michael observed these preparations with a growing certainty that what lay behind those doors would change the tone of everything that followed. The signs he had seen during his dives had not been ambiguous. They pointed to human presence under conditions that did not align with transport or shelter. Still, confirmation required evidence that could withstand scrutiny, not intuition. When the first reinforced door was opened, it resisted longer than expected, its hinges corroded yet stubborn, as if unwilling to yield after a century of silence. The sound it made when it finally gave way echoed through the compartment, a dull metallic groan that seemed to linger. The air that escaped carried no dramatic stench, only a stale, enclosed heaviness, the residue of a space that had not been meant to breathe freely. Inside, the room was narrow and bare. The walls were close enough to suggest confinement rather than efficiency. Along one side ran a series of crude bunks welded directly to the bulkhead, their frames warped by time but unmistakable in purpose. They were not arranged for comfort or privacy, but for density. On the opposite wall, metal rings were set at regular intervals, each bearing marks of prolonged stress. The floor beneath them was worn smooth in narrow arcs, patterns that spoke of restrained movement. No one spoke as the room was documented. Cameras captured every surface, every mark, while forensic specialists moved slowly, as if afraid that haste might erase something fragile. Michael stood back, watching, his earlier observations now confirmed with brutal clarity. This had not been a storage space or an improvised shelter. It had been a holding area. As adjacent compartments were opened, the pattern repeated with variations that suggested different functions within the same system. Some rooms were larger, divided by low partitions that offered the illusion of separation without real privacy. Others were smaller, windowless, their doors reinforced beyond necessity. In several, remnants of personal items lay scattered, too mundane to have been preserved intentionally. Fragments of clothing, worn shoes, a small tin container that once held something edible. Objects that told no grand story on their own, but together formed a record of ordinary lives reduced to inventory. On the walls, faint markings emerged as light and moisture revealed what corrosion had partially concealed. Names scratched hastily into metal, dates carved with crude tools, lines and symbols repeated over and over. Some inscriptions were incomplete, as if the writer had been interrupted or lost strength. Others overlapped, layers of desperation etched atop one another. These were not the marks of passengers passing time. They were the marks of people counting it. Michael felt the shift within himself as the documentation continued. The gold had been abstract, a concept of value. These rooms were not. They carried weight of a different kind, one that did not translate into numbers or legal claims. He recognized the instinct among some officials to minimize what they were seeing, to frame it cautiously as irregular accommodations or emergency modifications. But the evidence resisted such euphemisms. The ship's original passenger manifests were brought back into focus. Names that had once been written off as lost at sea now appeared again, scratched into steel beneath the decks. Cross-referencing began slowly, then accelerated as patterns emerged. Individuals listed as emigrants, laborers, or minor officials vanished from records shortly after boarding. Families had received notices of loss, condolences written in formal language, assurances that the sea had claimed them swiftly. The truth, preserved in rust and silence, told a different story. Further examination revealed logistical intent behind the confinement. The placement of the holding areas allowed controlled movement without exposure to passenger decks. Ventilation had been rerouted, food delivery simplified to minimize contact. This was not improvisation. It was design. Archives began to yield support and evidence. Old correspondence, once dismissed as bureaucratic noise, gained new relevance. Requests for discreet transport, approvals issued without explanation, references to individuals deemed unsuitable for public proceedings. These fragments formed a picture of a system that used the ship as a tool to remove people quietly, efficiently, and permanently. The scope of the operation grew harder to ignore. This was not the act of a single rogue captain or a desperate crew. It required coordination across institutions, funding beyond what a shipping company could easily conceal, and a level of confidence that consequences would never arrive. The ship had been chosen precisely because the sea offered plausible erasure. Michael's role evolved again, not by promotion, but by necessity. He was asked to guide investigators through the spaces he had first seen underwater, to explain structural choices and access routes. His calm, factual descriptions anchored the findings in physical reality. This was not rumor or speculation. It was architecture. As the days passed, the site grew crowded with observers who brought with them agendas as varied as their affiliations. Some sought accountability. Others sought containment. The tension between those impulses permeated every briefing. Language became carefully neutral, even as the evidence grew impossible to soften. Michael noticed attempts to redirect attention back to the gold, to keep public discourse centered on financial restitution rather than human suffering. He understood the strategy. Gold could be quantified, divided, and settled. The existence of a floating prison could not. It demanded questions that extended beyond ownership into morality and complicity. In private moments, Michael walked the length of the holding compartments alone, retracing the narrow paths and pausing before the marks left by unknown hands. He did not imagine their faces or invent their stories. He did not need to. The physical reality was enough. These were people who had expected to arrive somewhere and instead found themselves sealed beneath a deck, stripped of names and futures. The final confirmation came with the opening of a sealed locker found in one of the smallest compartments. Inside were papers preserved by oilcloth and chance, lists of names, numbers, and annotations written in a practiced hand. Notations indicating transfer, status, and final disposition. There was no language of rescue or uncertainty, only efficiency. When the contents were reviewed alongside official passenger records, the deception became undeniable. Entire groups had been removed from the public narrative, their existence acknowledged only within the closed logic of those who managed the ship's hidden purpose. The storm had not killed them. It had merely concealed their disappearance. By the time the chapter of discovery closed, the ship had been irrevocably transformed in the eyes of everyone involved. It was no longer an artifact of maritime history or even a vessel of stolen wealth. It was a mechanism of disappearance, preserved intact because no one had wanted it found. As Michael stood on the deck at the end of another long day, the sea calm beneath a fading sky, he understood that the ship's descent into darkness had not been an accident of weather. It had been a solution. And now that solution had failed. The compartments had been opened, the marks exposed, the names brought back into light. Whatever followed would not be controlled easily. The ship had begun to speak, and its voice carried far beyond steel and water, into archives, courts, and memories long denied. By the time the existence of the holding compartments became undeniable, the ship had already ceased to belong to the category of historical recovery. It had crossed into a different realm, one governed by forensic caution and political anxiety. The gold had fractured the financial narrative, the prison spaces had shattered the moral one, and now there remained a sealed section that many hoped would yield nothing at all. The reinforced door at the far end of the lower level bore markings that did not correspond to storage, security, or maintenance. They belonged to medicine. The decision to open the isolated section was delayed longer than any previous step, not because of technical difficulty, but because of what it implied. Medical spaces carried a different kind of consequence. They raised questions of contamination, liability, and responsibility that could not be settled by ownership claims or historical distance. Before access was granted, specialists in biological risk were brought in, and the ship was placed under protocols usually reserved for hazardous environments. Protective suits were issued, air samples taken, and the surrounding compartments sealed off to prevent cross-exposure. Michael watched these preparations with a growing sense of inevitability. The patterns uncovered so far suggested intent at every level: confinement, secrecy, logistics, financing. A medical section fit too well into that structure to be incidental. When authorization finally came, it did so with restrictions layered so heavily that they revealed more than they concealed. Someone expected consequences. The door opened slowly, releasing air that had been trapped for more than a century. It carried no sharp odor, no immediate sign of danger, but it felt heavy, as if saturated with long-settled history. Inside, the space was more organized than the holding compartments. Shelves lined the walls, their contents disturbed only by time. Metal trays lay stacked where they had been left. Glass containers rested in racks, clouded but intact. This was not chaos. It was a workplace. Michael entered first, moving carefully, aware that his presence alone altered the environment. The floor showed signs of repeated cleaning rather than neglect. Drains had been installed where none appeared on the original plans. Lighting fixtures, though long dead, had been positioned for focused work. Everything about the space suggested routine, rather than emergency. Documents lay on a central table, preserved by layers of oilcloth and luck. When they were unwrapped and laid out under controlled lighting, their significance became immediately clear. These were not passenger records or cargo logs. They were observation journals. Dates, names, symptoms, progress notes written in a clinical hand that betrayed no emotion. The language was precise, restrained, and chillingly methodical. As specialists examined the papers, patterns emerged that aligned too closely with known outbreaks of the era to be coincidence. References to fever, respiratory distress, and rapid decline appeared alongside instructions for isolation and restricted movement. Certain names were marked repeatedly, their entries ending abruptly. Others were transferred, noted as relocated to different compartments. There was no mention of recovery. Michael stood back as the implications took shape. The ship had not merely transported people secretly, it had transported disease. Whether intentionally or as a response to an emerging crisis, the vessel had been used as a floating quarantine, isolated from ports and populations. But unlike recognized quarantine ships, this one had not been monitored openly or supplied adequately. It had been hidden. The reason for that secrecy became clearer as the investigation widened. During the period of the ship's final voyage, governments faced intense pressure to maintain stability. Migration surged, economies strained, and public fear of contagion threatened trade and order. Acknowledging a dangerous outbreak among passengers would have meant port closures, economic disruption, and political fallout. Silence was easier. The ship offered a solution that satisfied multiple interests. Gold could be moved discreetly, people could be removed without trial or attention, and those carrying illness could be isolated beyond public view. It was efficiency cloaked as necessity. Further evidence reinforced this conclusion. Communications recovered from archives referenced instructions not to dock, to alter course, to remain offshore until further notice. There were no plans for treatment or evacuation, only containment. The medical journals recorded dwindling supplies, worsening conditions, and decisions made with limited options and diminishing concern for outcomes. At some point, the calculus shifted. The ship, burdened with gold, weapons, prisoners, and disease, became a liability rather than an asset. Its continued existence posed too many risks. Witnesses could survive. Records could surface. Disease could spread. The simplest resolution lay beneath the waves. The manner of the ship's sinking supported this interpretation. Structural analysis confirmed controlled flooding rather than catastrophic failure. Valves had been opened deliberately. Certain compartments were sealed while others were sacrificed, guiding the vessel into a descent that preserved its core structure while ensuring it would not be salvaged easily with the technology of the time. The storm provided cover, a narrative that required no further explanation. As these findings accumulated, public interest intensified despite attempts to manage information. Reports leaked, framed cautiously but unmistakably. Descendants of those listed in the journals began to come forward, drawn by names that matched family histories of disappearance. Legal inquiries expanded from financial restitution to human rights violations, even across the vast distance of time. Within the operation, the pressure became palpable. Officials who had once spoken confidently now deferred decisions. Meetings grew longer, outcomes vaguer. There was an unspoken hope that the sheer complexity of the case would dilute accountability. Michael felt that pressure most acutely in the quiet moments, when he was asked to clarify details that others preferred remain ambiguous. He did not editorialize. He did not assign blame. He described what he saw, what the structure revealed, what the documents confirmed. The ship had been altered to isolate, confine, and conceal. Its final descent had been engineered, not endured. The medical section, once fully documented, closed the circle that the gold and prison spaces had opened. Together, they formed a single coherent operation driven by profit, control, and fear. Each element supported the others. Remove any one, and the system would have failed. As Michael exited the sealed area for the last time, he felt no sense of completion, only weight. The ship had not been a victim of circumstance. It had been used, then discarded. Those who suffered within it had been calculated into decisions made far from the sea by people who trusted that water and time would erase responsibility. Standing on the deck as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the rusted hull, Michael understood that the story had reached a point of no return. The medical journals could not be reburied. The logic that had sunk the ship could not be reframed as accident. What followed would involve governments, courts, and historical reckoning. The ship had been sent to the bottom to prevent exactly this moment. And now, brought back into the light, it demanded answers that no amount of distance could absolve. By the time the medical section had been sealed and catalogued, the ship had become something far more dangerous than a relic. It was now a convergence point for crimes that spanned finance, politics, public health, and human rights. Each revelation deepened the sense that the vessel's final voyage had been orchestrated with ruthless clarity. Yet, even after the exposure of the quarantine measures and the deliberate sinking, one question remained unanswered. Why had the ship been worth such an elaborate operation in the first place? Gold explained part of it. Silence explained another, but neither fully justified the scale of coordination that had been uncovered. The answer lay deeper in the hull, in a section that had been deliberately obscured not only by structural modifications, but by layers of false documentation. The aft cargo holds, listed in surviving manifests as carrying agricultural equipment and industrial materials, had remained unopened longer than any other area. The delay was attributed to safety concerns, corrosion risks, and unstable decking. Those explanations were technically valid, but Michael recognized the pattern by now. Every delay coincided with significance. When preparations finally began, they did so under the strictest controls yet imposed. Explosive ordnance specialists were brought in, their presence officially justified by the possibility of hazardous materials from the early 20th century. In reality, their involvement signaled a level of expectation that no one voiced openly. The ship was no longer assumed to be dangerous by accident. It was assumed to be dangerous by design. Michael accompanied the team as access routes were cleared. The corridors leading toward the aft holds bore the same signs he had seen elsewhere: reinforced frames, rerouted systems, deliberate concealment. Yet, there was a difference here. The construction was heavier, more industrial, less concerned with saving space. Whatever had been hidden in this part of the ship was not fragile, nor was it meant to be handled discreetly by a small crew. It was meant to be moved efficiently. The first hold was opened slowly, under controlled conditions. As the door yielded, the interior light revealed rows of wooden crates stacked with military precision. The markings were unmistakable to trained eyes. Even before the first crate was opened, the stenciled symbols, faded but legible, told a story that no civilian cargo ever could. Inside the crates were weapons. Rifles lay packed in grease-soaked wrappings, their metal preserved against corrosion by careful preparation. Ammunition was stored in sealed tins, each labeled by caliber and production batch. Deeper within the hold, larger crates contained artillery shells, their mass alone a warning. This was not surplus or incidental equipment. It was a shipment prepared for immediate use. As more crates were documented, the scale of the operation became clear. The quantity exceeded anything that could be justified as personal armament or defensive cargo. This was supply, intended to sustain combat. The manufacturing marks tied the weapons to factories known to operate during the period. Some in countries that had officially declared neutrality during the conflict these weapons were destined for. Michael watched as the specialists worked, their movements careful, methodical. There was no shock in their expressions, only confirmation. The presence of weapons explained much that had previously seemed excessive. The secrecy, the use of a passenger vessel, the willingness to sacrifice lives. Arms trafficking under a civilian flag transformed the ship from a tool of concealment into a weapon of policy. The documentation deepened the implications. Shipping papers recovered from adjacent compartments listed benign goods, deliberately vague descriptions that masked the true nature of the cargo. Weights had been adjusted to avoid suspicion, though not enough to prevent overloading. The ship had sailed heavy by design, its margin for survival intentionally narrowed. Michael understood the logic as it emerged. A civilian vessel attracted less scrutiny. A storm-prone route provided plausible deniability. Should the ship arrive safely, the weapons would be delivered under cover of routine commerce. Should it fail, the loss could be attributed to nature, and the evidence would sink beyond reach. Either outcome served those who had planned the voyage. Political analysts brought in to assess the findings confirmed what many feared. The weapons aligned with known supply shortages in a specific conflict zone. Their presence contradicted decades of official statements regarding neutrality and non-involvement. Governments that had positioned themselves as observers had, in fact, been participants, profiting from instability while denying responsibility. The reaction was swift and guarded. Diplomatic channels activated quietly. Requests for restricted access to certain materials arrived, framed as national security concerns. Legal teams debated jurisdiction, attempting to confine the findings within narrow interpretations of maritime law. The ship, once again, became a battlefield, though this time the struggle was for narrative control. Michael felt the pressure more acutely now. His earlier discoveries had already placed him at the center of attention, but the weapons elevated his testimony from inconvenient to dangerous. He was not a political actor, yet his documentation undermined carefully maintained histories. He responded by narrowing his focus even further, anchoring every statement in observable fact: metal thickness, crate dimensions, manufacturing stamps, placement patterns. These were not opinions. They were realities. As the investigation connected the weapons to the gold, the final structure of the operation emerged. The gold had financed the purchase. The ship had transported the arms. The prisoners and the sick had been liabilities, risks to secrecy that could not be allowed to surface. The solution had been containment, then elimination through engineered loss. It was not chaos that had doomed the vessel. It was efficiency. Public reaction, once the existence of the weapons became impossible to deny, shifted dramatically. The story was no longer about lost treasure or historical curiosity. It was about complicity, about how neutrality had been weaponized, how civilians had been used as cover, how the sea had been trusted to erase evidence. Michael stood on the deck one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, its light catching on the rusted hull and the open cargo holds. The ship looked hollowed out now, its secrets exposed, its purpose laid bare. He felt no satisfaction in the revelations, only a growing awareness of the cost borne by those whose names had been scratched into steel below. The weapons had completed the picture. They explained the urgency, the scale, the willingness to sacrifice. They connected the ship's story to conflicts far beyond its decks, to decisions made in offices where human lives were variables and distance was protection. As the chapter closed, Michael understood that the remaining mystery was not what the ship carried, but who had authorized it, and how many had benefited while pretending innocence. The answers would not be found in the hull. They would be found in records, testimonies, and resistance. The ship had been raised from the sea, but the forces that had sunk it were still very much alive. By the time the weapons were fully cataloged, the ship no longer held any physical surprises. Its steel body had surrendered every hidden compartment, every reinforced corridor, every lie welded into its structure. What remained unresolved was not material, but human. The ship had revealed what it carried and why it had been sacrificed. Now, the question turned inevitably toward who had made those decisions and how they had ensured that responsibility would dissolve along with the vessel. The answer lay where Michael had expected it to be from the beginning: in the captain's domain. The search for the ship's log began cautiously, not because it was difficult to locate, but because it was dangerous to acknowledge its importance. A captain's log was not merely a record of navigation, it was a narrative of authority, the place where intent could be traced day by day, decision by decision. If the log survived, it would bind the disparate elements of the investigation into a single, chronological truth. The captain's quarters were located higher than the concealed compartments, but they were no less altered. Access routes had been subtly rerouted, and several internal partitions had been reinforced beyond necessity. When Michael entered the space with investigators, the atmosphere shifted again. Unlike the lower decks, this area showed signs of comfort and control. Furnishings, though degraded, reflected status rather than utility. The contrast between this space and the prison-like compartments below was stark and deeply unsettling. Initial searches yielded nothing. Drawers were empty, shelves bare. It was clear that someone had anticipated scrutiny. Either the log had been removed before the sinking, or it had been hidden with care. Michael studied the room not as a place of rest, but as a workspace. Captains of that era were meticulous. They trusted paper more than memory, especially when managing complex operations. He noticed the safe behind a panel that did not align perfectly with the wall. The concealment was crude by modern standards, but effective for its time. The safe itself bore signs of forced entry, not recent, but contemporary with the ship's final days. That detail mattered. It suggested urgency, not abandonment. The log was not inside the safe. Instead, it was found where few would think to look, secured within a narrow cavity beneath the cabin floor, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with resin. The placement spoke of intention. The captain had not planned to retrieve it. He had planned for it to survive. When the log was unwrapped and its pages carefully separated, the tone of the investigation changed permanently. The handwriting was steady throughout, even toward the end. There were no frantic entries, no descriptions of terror or confusion. Instead, the language was precise, operational, and calm. Early entries detailed routine matters, but as the voyage progressed, references appeared that did not align with a passenger ship. Mentions of restricted areas, special instructions from unnamed authorities, and schedules that required nighttime operations far from established routes. The captain documented meetings at sea, rendezvous points noted only by coordinates, and transfers that did not correspond to any official cargo. Crucially, the log recorded the redistribution of personnel. Certain crew members were reassigned to tasks unrelated to navigation or maintenance. Others were listed as relieved of duty at specific times, coinciding with unexplained absences from the ship's roster. These were not accidents. They were preparations. The final entries confirmed what structural analysis had already suggested. The ship did not encounter a catastrophic storm. Weather conditions were noted, but not as a threat. Instead, the captain described controlled flooding procedures, referencing compartments to be sealed and others to be sacrificed. He noted compliance with standing orders and expressed confidence that evacuation arrangements were in place. There was no mention of passengers, no accounting for those held below. They had been removed from the narrative entirely. Further analysis revealed how the captain and select crew members had survived. The log referenced a secondary vessel, unnamed but identifiable through coordinates and timing. Lifeboats were launched not in panic, but according to plan. Supplies had been staged, personal belongings removed in advance. The ship was abandoned deliberately, left to sink with those deemed expendable. Michael felt the weight of these revelations not as shock, but as confirmation. Everything he had seen within the hull now aligned with a human logic that was cold, consistent, and methodical. The ship had not failed. It had been executed. Tracing the aftermath required work beyond the vessel itself. Names from the crew list were cross-referenced with immigration records, census data, and corporate registries. Patterns emerged quickly. Several individuals reappeared under altered identities within a decade of the sinking. They relocated to countries that did not question documentation aggressively. They entered industries tied to shipping, finance, and manufacturing. Their wealth appeared suddenly without clear origin. Businesses were founded, properties acquired, influence cultivated. The gold that had vanished with the ship had not been lost. It had been laundered through lives rebuilt under new names. Descendants began to surface as the investigation progressed. Some came forward voluntarily, seeking to distance themselves from the findings. Others arrived through legal channels asserting claims to the recovered gold. Their arguments relied on inheritance, on the assumption that time had dissolved accountability. They underestimated the endurance of evidence. The tension surrounding Michael intensified as his documentation connected the physical findings to human trajectories. Attempts were made to challenge his credibility, to frame his conclusions as interpretation rather than observation. He responded by narrowing his testimony further. He spoke only of what could be measured, traced, and verified. The log's handwriting matched known samples. The coordinates corresponded with known shipping routes. The dates aligned. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted to limit publication. Officials argued that exposing the full scope of the operation would destabilize long-standing diplomatic narratives. The past, they insisted, should remain in the past. Michael understood the argument. He rejected it. The log entries were released in part, then in full, as legal challenges made containment impossible. The public response was immediate and unforgiving. The ship was no longer a mystery. It was a case study in how institutions protected themselves by erasing people. For Michael, the most difficult moments came not during briefings or testimony, but in the quiet hours when he reviewed the names scratched into steel below decks and compared them to the omissions in the log. The captain had recorded everything except the existence of those who suffered most. Their erasure had been deliberate, absolute. As this chapter of the investigation closed, Michael recognized that the ship's story was nearly complete. The materials had been recovered, the mechanisms exposed, the perpetrators identified, even if they could not be punished directly. What remained was not discovery, but consequence. The ship had been sunk to end a story. Instead, it had preserved it, waiting for the moment when steel and paper could speak louder than silence. The publication of the captain's log marked the moment when the ship ceased to be an object of investigation and became a matter of reckoning. What followed was no longer driven by divers, engineers, or archivists, but by institutions that had spent generations perfecting the art of delay. Committees were formed, statements drafted, and language carefully chosen to soften what could no longer be denied. The ship had been sunk deliberately. It had carried gold, weapons, prisoners, and the sick. It had served interests that extended far beyond its decks. Now, the question was not whether the truth was known, but how much of it would be allowed to stand unchanged. Official conclusions emerged slowly, wrapped in dense reports and appendices that few outside professional circles would ever read in full. The tone was measured, almost apologetic in its caution. Words like crime and murder were avoided, replaced with phrases such as systemic failure, ethical breach, and historical context. Responsibility was described as diffuse, spread across an era rather than anchored to individuals. Time, it was argued, complicated justice. Yet, even as these efforts unfolded, the ship resisted simplification. The physical evidence could not be rewritten. The compartments remained. The medical journals still bore names and dates. The weapons crates still carried manufacturing stamps. The gold still matched missing reserves. Each attempt to reduce the narrative collided with material fact. Lawsuits began to appear in multiple jurisdictions. Some were filed by descendants of those whose names had been recovered from the holding compartments and medical records. Others came from financial institutions seeking to reclaim the gold, arguing continuity of ownership despite the passage of time. Governments entered the legal field reluctantly, often positioning themselves as mediators rather than defendants, even when the documents told a different story. Michael observed these developments from a position that was both central and peripheral. He was called to testify repeatedly, his statements drawn directly from his documentation and field reports. He never spoke of intent beyond what the evidence supported. He described welds, placements, alterations, patterns. He described what could be seen, measured, and verified. That restraint made his testimony difficult to dismiss. The most contentious debates centered on the gold. Banks argued that the recovery represented restitution, not discovery, that the assets should return quietly to institutional control. Descendants of the disappeared countered that the gold had financed crimes, and that its value could not be separated from the suffering it enabled. Courts struggled to balance precedent against morality, ownership against origin. As hearings continued, archives began to open that had been sealed for decades. Documents, once classified for reasons of national security, were released under pressure, revealing correspondence that confirmed what the ship itself had shown. Officials had known. Orders had been given. Silence had been maintained deliberately. Neutrality, it became clear, had been a performance. Public reaction evolved from shock to fatigue, then to anger. The story refused to fade, resurfacing with each new disclosure. Memorials were proposed. Names were read aloud in chambers where they had never been spoken before. Families who had lived with uncertainty were forced to confront a different kind of grief, one shaped not by loss alone, but by betrayal. For Michael, the final phase of the process was the quietest and the heaviest. The ship itself had been moved to a secured coastal facility, supported by massive steel frames. It stood exposed to air and light for the first time since its sinking, a corroded monument stripped of mystery. Visitors walked its perimeter, guided by officials who explained its significance in careful terms. Michael sometimes stood apart from these tours, watching as people tried to reconcile the physical presence of the vessel with the weight of what it represented. He thought often of the moments underwater, before the gold, before the documents, when the ship had been only metal and shadow. He had not known then how complete the story would become, how thoroughly the vessel would resist erasure. The sea had preserved what people had tried to bury. In the end, there was no single verdict that satisfied every claim. Some cases were settled quietly, others dragged on, unresolved. The gold was placed under international custodianship, its final disposition deferred indefinitely. The ship was designated a protected historical site, though the term felt inadequate. What mattered most to Michael was not the outcome of any particular ruling, but the permanence of the record. The compartments had been mapped, the names documented, the decisions traced. The story could no longer be reduced to a storm or a navigational error. It existed now as a sequence of choices made by people who believed distance and time would shield them. On his final visit to the site, Michael walked along the hall, his hand brushing against the rough surface where rust flaked away under his fingers. The ship no longer felt like a puzzle. It felt like a witness. He understood then that the truth had never been hidden by the ocean. It had been hidden by people, by agreements, by silence. The sea had only held it intact until someone was willing to look without expecting comfort. As he left the facility and the ship receded behind him, Michael carried no sense of triumph. Only a quiet certainty that some stories, once raised from the depths, could never be sunk again. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. New stories are coming soon, and the next one may be even darker than this. Watch the next video on the channel to uncover more hidden truths and real stories that were buried for years. And don't forget to share this video with someone who loves deep, true stories. It really helps the channel grow.